Hello everyone, this is Lord Artorius Collbrande, and today I want to discuss The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and why I believe this game has a bad story, and why I believe, because this game is Game of the Year for 2023 objectively for a lot of people, that it opens discussion that it's concerning that the game industry literally does not care anymore for having standards for writing compelling narratives in video games. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was a solid game overall, but if I'm going to be honest with you, I actually thought it was pretty disappointing. This may be a bit of a controversial take, but I genuinely believe that if this was truly the best game that came out this year, I think that this shows me that the state overall with gaming is really starting to decline and become worse as time passes. The truth is that modern gaming is more flawed than it was in previous times before this, and I think it's mainly due to a variety of things, such as more formulaic game design, games with worse storytelling, more woke propaganda and left-wing agenda garbage, like in the Saints Row reboot, for example, and more cheesy, Hollywood-esque, and over-the-top bloated aesthetic design. Many games also suffer from problems such as microtransactions, paywalls, and scams within them. While Tears of the Kingdom is far better than games, of course, like The Lord of the Rings, Golem, and Redfall, I feel like that's also a huge problem, because even though that's true, Tears of the Kingdom is still inferior to a lot of games and other Zelda games that all came out before it. This video is not a full review going all the way in depth with The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, but I just wanted to make a video going over some of the issues and a few positives I had experienced the game while playing the game. I feel like there's too much content in the game to literally cover all of it right this second, and while I definitely finished the main story in the game, there's still a lot of side content that I haven't even touched yet, and I thought the game wasn't quite great enough to just push through and complete every side mission. I think one day I'll be ready to make a full review of this game, but not quite yet. While I won't go full in-depth talking about the entire game as a whole, I will go far in depth talking about the story, because I do feel compelled enough that I do have a lot to say about it. By the way, before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss all the latest cool content I make. Please also hit the like button so that way you can show me that you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much, and now on to the video. My biggest gripe with Tears of the Kingdom was actually the story. I looked forward to this game in hopes that it would fix the one biggest issue that I had with Breath of the Wild, which was its weak narrative and lack of subtle storytelling. This was an even bigger issue in Age of Calamity, considering the fact that that game didn't even bother connecting coherently as a prequel to Breath of the Wild. The story overall throughout all three of these games is very disjointed and convoluted, rarely actually making sense with one another, and the story often feels like it has a ton of gaps missing from it to truly piece everything together. Tears of the Kingdom's story is honestly terrible, and it's actually really strange too. We open the game, and the first part that we see is Link and Zelda going down beneath Hyrule Castle, and for some reason, Zelda has a hair up her ass about learning about Zonai, and they run into Ganondorf with absolutely no context of anything leading up to this first part of the game that acts as the tutorial. The biggest thing I find off-putting about this part in particular is that all the memory cutscenes in the game actually take place after this very first part of the game. One could try arguing that these are Zelda's memories before she became a dragon, but at the same time, they aren't really memories since this is going to the perspective after, for whatever reason, Zelda disappeared and warped back in time to the first era of Hyrule. Yeah, all the memories in the game literally take place after this first cutscene in the game, which I find a little bit odd. So they're not really memories. They are, but they aren't. And I do think that the perspective is a little disjointed when you kind of question, how are these really memories? One of the reasons why the entire story in Tears of the Kingdom sucks is because the game does very little to explain anything that the story needs to piece everything together, and all we get is a very basic structured plot that's bare bones, like how it was designed in Breath of the Wild. And this all comes ahead to Rauru as a character. While Rauru is not the most annoying or most unlikable character in history, my biggest problem with him is really just that he's boring. He doesn't really have much of a personality besides just kind of existing for the sake of the plot, and we get no real insight into how the Zonai are Zelda's ancestors. While I will give the story credit for at least addressing that Zelda is a far descendant from Rauru and Sonia, we get absolutely no further development as to how it's possible they're really related, which is especially jarring when you consider how Zelda looks in each and every single Zelda game besides Tears of the Kingdom, and also how her father usually looks. I find it very odd because if you think about it, the story wouldn't even really be much different even if the king was a Hylian, mainly because Rauru's focus as a character himself is barely seen throughout the story, and the game is just more worried about building how Zelda became a dragon without thinking of really a ton of other important details the game should really focus on. I harp on Rauru a lot because, in my opinion, I thought it was actually a huge disappointing letdown how, despite the fact that they kind of just make up this new idea that the Zonai exist and they don't even bother connecting it to be coherent with Breath of the Wild, especially since it's a sequel, is totally asinine. I think besides the story's own issues, because as a story itself, it handles exposition in the laziest way possible. Another huge issue with the game is the fact that it does so little work to actually connect with Breath of the Wild, barely making it feel like a sequel. The only connection I actually see between them is the fact that Master Koga is back in Tears of the Kingdom, but we don't actually see any interactions between him and Ganondorf, because the game is too lazy to go beyond its comfort zone from being like Breath of the Wild in every single way possible, while also kind of not being like Breath of the Wild. Everything we've ever learned about with Guardians, the Divine Beasts, Calamity Ganon, and even the Champions is completely irrelevant here in Tears of the Kingdom, and that's because the game tries to act like it's such a breath of fresh air when it's really just the same wall painted with a different coat of paint on it. If you played Age of Calamity or Breath of the Wild, it's impossible not to ask how in the living hell our Ganondorf and Calamity Ganon are connected to one another. One could make the inference call that Ganondorf's spirit must have poured out of him while he was sealed underneath Hyrule Castle, but the game never shows or even tells you this, or even brings up how an idea or something like that could even be possible. So it just kind of creates gaping plot holes, like how are Ganondorf and Calamity Ganon connected from a narrative standpoint? Like, how are they the same character? See what I'm saying? Like, the game doesn't bother explaining this, and it just leaves these details out. So you're just supposed to come up with your own theories as to how something like this could actually be possible. And I find that really annoying. This game treats Breath of the Wild like it almost never existed, meanwhile copying a lot of the same elements, and to me that's a serious design problem. To be fair, I also blame Age of Calamity quite a bit too for having the same problem, because much like how Tears of the Kingdom is a sequel to Breath of the Wild and barely connects with each other, Age of Calamity is the prequel taking place 100 years before Breath of the Wild. I think Age of Calamity created a terrible trend with these games that would just be totally acceptable, a totally acceptable thing to just create a convoluted piece of shit story that can just get away with disconnecting from the grounded story that they made in previous games because they know the Zelda fanboys will eat it all up anyways. Therefore, this helps us put into perspective why they just thought it was okay to just forget Breath of the Wild when they made Tears of the Kingdom, because Nintendo doesn't give two flying shits about grounding storytelling. They don't actually care about creating a coherent timeline, and therefore they just want to make up shit and just expect people will just eat it all up. If you want to know exactly how this game has a big problem with the way how it handles exposition, look no further than the fact that we are literally shown the same exact cutscene 4 or 5 times about the imprisoning war, as if we couldn't already see the simple fact Rauru used his arm to seal away Ganondorf and sacrificed himself. You think maybe this information gets beat down on your skull a little bit too much? Like we're idiots? Literally every time you beat a dungeon in the game and defeat a boss, you are given the same exact exposition dumps from each of the 4 ancestors, and 5 if you can include Minoru, about the same exact information over and over again. It's monotonous and boring when you're just showing same exact information we already know and can't be creative enough to be bothered coming up with anything else to fill in the gaps of storytelling. I also think that while Ganondorf has always been my favorite Zelda character throughout time, I do think that they could have given him more depth as a character and better written dialogue than what we actually got in the game. Don't get me wrong. I think there's still definitely, still some fun scenes that Ganondorf is in. And I actually think the first 2 phases of the final boss are really cool, except the final phase where he turns into a dragon. But I do think that they made him feel a little generic as a villain in this game. I do think that he's still a little bit of a badass sometimes, and that's cool. But I don't really like some of his dialogue. I do feel like they could have given him just a little bit more depth than just being a one-dimensional evil bad guy. What I mean by that is that they don't really bother fleshing out a reason why he wants to kill Hyrule and become the Demon King, and what really gets to me is that his dialogue isn't really good. I especially thought it was bad when he would simply just told Link that light was insufferable and darkness should just take over everything. It just feels really cookie cutter and shallow. Don't get me wrong, I love Ganondorf, and I'm actually so happy that he's finally back in a Zelda game, but I just think that they could have given him a better leg to stand on with some of his dialogue and place in the story. Going back to Rauru, there's one other thing that bothers me. I think his relationship with Sonia was kind of weak. I personally saw no weight to it, as both characters never felt like they really had any chemistry or cool interactions with one another. So when Ganondorf shows up behind Sonia and kills her, I felt like it had nothing from it. Like it had no real weight to it or emotions. While it is entertaining to just see Ganondorf screw around, I do think that we didn't really get enough time to spend time with these characters to really feel the relationship as compelling. It felt like Sonia was never really a person all in herself, and instead the characters just felt like they were plot devices leading to Zelda's transformation and demise turning into a dragon, which leads to one last thing I really want to talk about with the story, which is the plot twist turning into a dragon. Although I do want to just say, personally, in my opinion, with Sonia, one of my biggest problems with her in particular is just the fact that I feel like they just don't really give her any character. Like, all the characters kind of feel like they're just written around Zelda, and I feel like they're not really given any arc of their own. And I personally think that that is really frustrating. Although, moving on, personally, I wasn't really a huge fan of the plot twist where Zelda turns into a dragon. I personally never thought it was really explained well that the stones would turn, like why the stones would turn you into a dragon, and the reasons aren't there to explain what it would do to someone if they consumed it. I know this is a minor complaint, but it really bothers me because it's all part of a much larger issue with the game's story. I understand that the game was trying to have weight to her making such a troubling decision because it would mean throwing away the rest of Zelda's life to be cursed as an immortal dragon with no chance of becoming human again. But personally, I think the game would have been darker and more toned well if the game had its focus on Zelda trying to prove her innocence of the crimes she's been framed for while going against her false evil version of herself created by Ganondorf as a puppet. I actually thought it was weird that even though Zelda in this game does a ton of bad things, faces no consequences for her actions, and everybody just kind of lets it go. Moving on, even if you're someone who disagrees and thinks that the plot twist was interesting and works as something tragic, it all gets ruined by one thing, and that's the game's ending. I feel like it had nothing. I feel like there's one thing that's a huge issue leading to this part, and that's how poorly they write Zelda and Link's relationship, which has honestly been done much better in games like Wind Waker. The problem with Zelda and Link's relationship in Tears of the Kingdom, and this problem actually stems across Age of Calamity and Breath of the Wild as well, is that they really have no chemistry with one another. In Tears of the Kingdom, most of the entire game is not even focused on Link and Zelda interacting with one another, let alone having any engaging moments with one another. To be honest with you, I never found their relationship that interesting ever since Breath of the Wild, mainly because in Breath of the Wild, my biggest gripe with them was how not only did Link have a harem between her and Mipha, but any interaction he had with Zelda was never them just caring about one another, and Link also feels like a blank slate of a protagonist in that game. Also in Tears of the Kingdom, because he has no more personality than he did in Breath of the Wild. Compare that with a truly compelling love story like between Shulk and Fiora, and that literally blows that game apart without even thinking about it. And that's because the difference between all three of those Zelda games compared to a legendary game like Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is that Xenoblade Chronicles actually has every scene they interact with one another feel impactful because you can feel the strong chemistry they have with one another. you can actually see that Shulk cares deeply about Fiora and did anything to avenge her death. And you can see how broken he becomes as a person eventually, seeing that Fiora is actually still alive, and was shocked by how horrifying it was that she was turned into the very thing he swore to destroy. You actually see moments between them that had meaning, like that time that they were on the falling arm together and Shulk brought her water to make sure she was okay. Or that moment, before Fiora died, that she was giving Shulk a sandwich, and it was meant to show that they actually care about one another. You actually see moments between those characters that actually mean things. The relationship was compelling. You actually feel happy that they were together. And at the end of the game, you actually had a satisfying conclusion where they were back with one another and they could actually have a future together. And it was a fantastic story. Xenoblade Chronicles is one game that I greatly remember for its wonderful story and characters and the fantastic world building. And that's because it actually knows how to piece a story together. And it actually pieces together a great love story between, the two main characters. And, I feel like that's what's missing from Tears of the Kingdom, is that it just doesn't have a compelling, bond between its characters. Even Wind Waker did a much better job than Breath of the Wild, Age of Calamity, and Tears of the Kingdom with writing a truly compelling relationship. Because in that game, you actually felt a sense of progression between Link and Zelda. Sure, it still felt like Link and Zelda were just kind of friends in that game. But the story was compelling enough that it felt interesting that Tetra learned that she was actually Zelda. And you can see moments of how Link and her actually became closer. And Wind Waker was a great game. So it actually shows that even compared to other games in the same franchise, The Legend of Zelda has actually done, writing Zelda and Link better as characters. Skyward Sword is another example of a game that also did a much better job than Tears of the Kingdom, because in that game, Link and Zelda actually had chemistry with one another and felt like they actually were engaged with one another, and being involved with one another. You could actually see the relationship, progressing, when they were on Skyloft, and they were kind of, being goofballs with one another. And I thought that was actually pretty cool. Tears of the Kingdom feels really half-assed at the end of the game, because not only does the issue of Zelda turning into a dragon come into fruition, but it also feels like there's zero impact in the story with Link saving Zelda. I think it's a problem mainly because it's such an ass pull that Link can just save her by simply using powers inside him, and you see Rauru and Sonia together using powers to turn Zelda back into a human from being a dragon. With that right there, you can see how all the tension and weight behind Zelda's decision to become a dragon gets literally pissed on and thrown into the toilet and flushed, with shit gurgling all over it too. The biggest problem with this is the fact that they found no logical way to bring her back into a Highland before the final battle, so that way they wouldn't be pulling the shit out of their ass at the end. Personally, I wish we could have gotten more details as to what the sacred stones were, so we could have understood their effects on people that consume them better. Instead, however, you're just left with Link and Zelda together, and shit just happens because the game gives you literally the middle finger. I personally would have liked the story a lot more if the writing between Link and Zelda was more solid, but the problem is that we really get no scenes building the relationship, and the character writing feels static with little to no arc that they have together. Everything is just about Zelda, and her getting too much focus is the biggest problem with the story. Don't get me wrong. I think that there's still a lot of other problems in this game's story, like how I mentioned with, the Zonai being really underdeveloped. But I feel like this is also really one of the biggest problems in the story, mainly because every single Zelda game is about Link and Zelda. And, in order to keep that fresh, you have to find some way to keep their relationship actually interesting and compelling, which is what this game and Breath of the Wild and Age of Calamity all fail with doing. They could have added more cutscenes and expanded on the ideas if they had more to feel like the game actually had substance to its writing, and we could have understood better the world and times that this game is trying to build. But unfortunately, that just gets chucked in the lava pit and then eaten by Cerberus dogs from hell, owned by Hades. Yes, I honestly thought the story in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was literally atrocious. I think the story fails not only because does it fail to connect with its predecessors in most directions, but I also think the amount of same exposition being thrown into your head is just so stupid and so monotonous. Also, with keeping a very basic structure that just, tries to be like Breath of the Wild without trying to breathe air and expand on any idea. I didn't even mention how the story has other issues, like how every new character they newly introduce is irritating, like Tulid, who just quickly turns into the most trusted warrior in Rito Village without doing much, and Yona, who's apparently Sidon's love interest, even though they just feel completely forced together. But I honestly thought that there were still way bigger problems in the story. But to be fair, I will honestly mention the fact that Yona is literally just some made-up bitch that just loves Sidon for no reason, and I thought that was really forced garbage. And the game doesn't even try to actually make any of its old characters more interesting either. The game just, still just keeps all the basic things that Breath of the Wild had and does nothing else. I feel like the relationship between Sidon and Yona was completely forced. And I just think that, really just in general, like all the characters just had really weak development from Breath of the Wild. Honestly, I did think that Tears of the Kingdom did have potential to write a good story. On paper, some of these ideas actually seem pretty interesting and cool. I was actually a little excited for this game coming out when I saw that Ganondorf was coming back in a Zelda game. I think there are small moments where the game could have made its story a lot more engaging and powerful. Unfortunately, it all falls short because the game's story feels limited by its design and doesn't go in directions enough to breathe beyond simply writing a basic plot with Deus Ex Machina tropes and ass pulls. There are other issues with the game, like how I think its dungeons are mediocre, but I honestly mainly wanted to talk about the game's story for now, which I'll also probably discuss again in a video in a long time from now. When I make a video one day in the future which will one day actually be my full critique of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. It may actually seem like after I cracked open the skull and pissed on this game's story that I'm not a huge fan of this game, but that's actually not true, believe it or not. I actually do like this game. I do like Tears of the Kingdom. I actually think that there's still a lot of cool positives in this game. For example, one thing that I loved in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom was cooking food. I always thought it was fun going across the world map and collecting food and cooking it. I actually think Tears of the Kingdom improves upon Breath of the Wild's mechanics, actually, even further, by allowing you to cook even more recipes like fried chicken, for example, And even better is the fact that now, unlike Breath of the Wild, you could keep track of every single food recipe you make. And I think that's totally awesome. I also think it's cool how, much like Breath of the Wild, you always had a ton of land to explore. And that was something that I loved in both games. And now you have even more land you could explore in Tears of the Kingdom, because now you have 2 whole new maps more than just the reused Breath of the Wild map. I think it's cool that you could fuse items with swords that you find, and I think it's easily a pretty cool power-up that they give you in the game. And even though I do think that, I will criticize it a little bit, that sometimes the weapons you make could look a little bit stupid. Sometimes they don't really put a lot of effort into really designing, fusing items together well with your weapons. Sometimes they can look really cool, like being able to combine a sword with a silver Lionel saber, which I think is actually pretty cool. Overall, I'd still give Tears of the Kingdom a 6 out of 10, which is 1 point I rate it lower than Breath of the Wild. Even though I was pretty disappointed with Tears of the Kingdom because it didn't fix the biggest gripe that I have with Breath of the Wild, I still thought it was a pretty solid game overall. It does have some of the same charm Breath of the Wild had. I know this rating will be controversial, but it is honestly how I felt about this game. I felt like while it was still an above average game, I still thought that it could have been a lot better, unfortunately. The only reason why I rate it lower than Breath of the Wild, because I actually gave Breath of the Wild a 7 out of 10, is because Breath of the Wild was a more original game and was actually more of a breath of fresh air than Tears of the Kingdom. And that kind of sucks in Tears of the Kingdom, because I feel like Tears of the Kingdom just wasn't really a breath of fresh air like how Breath of the Wild was. Tears of the Kingdom just wasn't a breath of fresh air as Breath of the Wild. Sorry. The reason why I made this video today is because I feel like the video game industry and many industries as a whole are giving shits less and less about good storytelling and characters, and they know they can just put a shit in a box and draw some cool art on it and have it be worth $70, and the fanboys will just slurp it all up. They'll just slurp up and eat up the mountain of rotten pig shit splattered all over inside it. All over inside the box. To be honest, though, I am concerned for the future of the Zelda franchise. I'm worried that these people will just continue having every new Zelda game be Breath of the Wild again. All I have to say is that if Breath of the Wild's aesthetic and map are going to be reused again in another Zelda game, I'm not going to be excited. I'll be pissed because I feel like creativity is dying every day moving forward, and people just want to recycle shit because they don't want to come up with any new original ideas, and that sets a bad example for the game industry as a whole. We get too many games nowadays, like garbage games like Redfall and Golem, showing that the game industry is giving even less shits now about the quality of their game coming out. It's time to demand better and vote with our wallets, or we'll just get more poorly written stories in video games like in Tears of the Kingdom or like Final Fantasy 13. I feel like even though that this game had potential to have a good story, it just didn't, mainly because of all the reasons why I listed in this video today. Let me know let me know down below what you thought in the comments. Do you agree that Tears of the Kingdom proves that the game industry has no standards anymore for quality storytelling? Or do you actually think Tears of the Kingdom story was actually great and you disagree with all my points? No matter what, I respect everybody's opinions and I'm always open to discussion. This is just my take, and thank you very much for respecting and understanding where I'm coming from, at least. Please hit that subscribe button for more content, and please hit that like button and share the video. I love opening discussion on the topic of things, and I respect everyone's opinions. This is just my take that Tears of the Kingdom story is garbage, And I just think that it's showing the decline of the video game industry's standards and storytelling. This is all just my take, and thank you very much for watching.